The breakdown. The morning sun rose over the glass towers of downtown, spilling sharp golden light across busy streets, where horns blared and tires screeched as impatient drivers fought for space on the road. Ella Montgomery gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black Range Rover, her heart pounding against her chest as though it wanted to escape. She had already rehearsed her presentation a dozen times in her head, her mind calculating numbers, projected revenue charts, and memorized phrases that she hoped would convince her board to trust her vision. Today was not just another meeting. It was the meeting, the one that would decide whether her bold expansion plan would be approved or whether she would be dismissed as too reckless for her position as CEO. She had worked her whole life for this role, fought harder than anyone else, and sacrificed friendships, relationships, and countless nights of sleep. Failure was not an option. But life had other plans. A thin stream of smoke curled from under the hood, and Ella's stomach dropped as she glanced at the dashboard. The engine temperature needle was buried deep in the red. She muttered under her breath and smacked the steering wheel with the flat of her palm. The vehicle shuddered as though it had taken her frustration personally, and with one last cough, the engine died completely, leaving her stranded in the very middle of a crowded intersection. Behind her, horns erupted like a symphony of anger. Drivers shouted insults through their open windows. A delivery truck swerved dangerously close, the driver throwing his arm out and yelling before zooming past. Ella felt heat flood her face as humiliation mixed with panic. She pressed the start button again and again, but the car only clicked uselessly. A lump formed in her throat as she realized she was stuck, and every second wasted here was a second closer to dismissal. At the board meeting. From the back seat came a small, trembling voice. "Mommy, will we be late?" It was her daughter Lily, clutching her beloved stuffed bunny with both arms as if squeezing it tighter would somehow protect her from the chaos outside. At only 6 years old, Lily had already learned to be sensitive to her mother's moods, to pick up on the tension in Ella's voice and shoulders. Her wide, shimmering eyes looked up from the car seat, searching for reassurance. Ella swallowed hard, blinking quickly to keep the tears from spilling. "No, baby," she said, forcing her voice into calmness, though her chest felt like it was caving in. "Mommy's trying. We'll be fine." She reached a hand back to squeeze her daughter's knee, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of Lily's leggings. "We'll be just fine." But inside, she was anything but fine. Every minute she sat here meant the board members were checking their watches, whispering doubts, maybe even thinking of alternatives. In her world, lateness was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Pedestrians crossed hurriedly, glancing disapprovingly at her expensive car blocking traffic. Some muttered about rich people who couldn't even maintain their vehicles. A man in a business suit shook his head dramatically as though she had personally offended him. Embarrassment clung to Ella like a second skin. She thought of calling roadside assistance, but the idea of waiting for a tow truck felt like a nightmare. Her perfectly planned day was unraveling, thread by thread. And then she saw him. A man pedaling a bicycle slowed down near the edge of the street. He wore worn jeans and a faded gray t-shirt streaked with oil stains, a backpack slung across his shoulder. He stopped a few feet away, glancing at the smoking SUV, then at the growing line of angry drivers swerving around it. His expression carried hesitation, like someone caught between minding his own business and stepping into someone else's problem. For a long moment he just stood there, pushing a lock of messy dark hair out of his eyes. Then, with a quiet sigh, he leaned his bike against a nearby lamppost and walked toward the driver's side of the stranded car. Ella noticed him approach, her first reaction defensive. In the city, you never knew who you could trust. She rolled her window down slightly, enough to hear but not enough for a stranger to reach in. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped with tension though not unkind. "Looks like your engine's overheating," the man said simply, his tone calm and steady, as if traffic jams and angry honking didn't exist around him. His voice cut cleanly through the chaos. "If you pop the hood, I can take a quick look." Ella blinked at him, torn. He didn't look like a professional, but there was something about the certainty in his tone, the lack of judgment in his eyes that made her pause. "You're a mechanic?" she asked skeptically. He gave a small shrug. "Let's just say I've fixed more cars than I can count. Yours is screaming for attention. And if you keep trying to start it, you might blow the gasket. Mind if I take a look? From the back seat, Lily's curious face peeked out. Is he going to help us, Mommy? She asked, her voice filled with hope. Ella felt her daughter's gaze and her own walls softened slightly. Against her instincts, she pulled the hood release. The latch clicked and the man lifted it open, leaning forward into the rising smoke. He moved with ease, pulling a rag from his back pocket, checking the hoses, unscrewing the coolant cap slightly. His hands were rough, streaked with old scars, but they moved like they had done this 1,000 times. He didn't panic, didn't frown, didn't curse. He simply worked, calm in the storm of noise and frustration around them. Ella stepped out of the car, heels clicking against the pavement. Are you sure you know what you're doing? She asked, folding her arms. He gave her a small half smile. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. Relax. I'm not going to charge you or anything. That last sentence startled her. Most men would have tried to take advantage, offering help in exchange for money or favors. But his tone was free of expectation, just honest. She studied him for a moment, the strong line of his jaw, the sunburn on his arms, the determined way he focused on the engine. Within minutes, the noise of honking cars around her seemed to fade, her attention fixed on the stranger who appeared out of nowhere, someone who carried himself with quiet confidence. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like the chaos had slowed just enough for her to breathe again. The man worked steadily, ignoring the frustrated drivers who swerved around the stalled SUV with honking horns and muttered curses. He bent over the engine with the concentration of someone who had spent years learning to listen to machines, as if they were speaking a language only he could understand. Ella stood beside him, arms still folded, trying to convince herself that she was only letting him help because she had no choice. Yet, even as she told herself that, she noticed the quiet steadiness of his movements, the way his brow furrowed only slightly as he adjusted a hose clamp and checked the coolant line. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, but without arrogance. It was clear this wasn't the first time he had saved someone in distress on the road. He had the calm of someone used to emergencies. She realized then that he hadn't even introduced himself. She opened her mouth to ask his name, but before she could speak, Lily's small face appeared again through the back window. The child pressed her palm against the glass, her stuffed bunny squished between her chin and shoulder. She looked at him with wide-eyed fascination, the way children sometimes stared at people they sensed were important. Even if they didn't know why, he noticed her gaze and offered her a little smile, the kind of smile that softened even his rugged features. Lily immediately smiled back, her fear melting into curiosity. Looks like the water pump's failing, he finally said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Not the worst problem in the world, but not something you want to ignore either. I can patch it up enough to get you moving, at least until you can get it properly repaired. Ella sighed, exasperated. Of course, today of all days. She shook her head and muttered to herself, why now? Her pulse quickened again at the thought of her boardroom, of investors tapping their watches, of phones buzzing with irritation at her absence. He glanced at her briefly, then back to the engine. You've got somewhere important to be. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Yes, she said more sharply than she intended. Then her voice softened because for some reason his calm tone made her feel less defensive. I have a meeting. A very important one. And if I don't get there on time... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't want to explain her entire world to a stranger in the middle of the street. He gave a small nod, as if he understood more than she said. Then let's not waste time. He worked quickly, using a simple wrench he pulled from his backpack, tightening a joint here, adjusting a valve there. His movements were practiced but careful, like a man who had learned to fix things not because it was glamorous, but because life had left him no choice. Ella found herself watching not just his hands, but the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders carried both strength and weariness. He looked like a man who had been through storms, but had chosen not to let them break him. When he finally stepped back, the engine hummed weakly but alive again. It'll hold for now, he said, shutting the hood with a decisive motion. Drive straight to where you need to go, but afterward, get it checked properly. Don't push your luck. Ella opened her purse, already reaching for her wallet. Thank you. How much do I owe you? He shook his head immediately, already turning to retrieve his bicycle from the lamppost. Nothing. It was 5 minutes of my life. Just get to your meeting. She frowned, not used to people refusing payment. In her world, everything had a price, and nothing came without expectation. I insist, she said firmly. At least let me pay you for your time. He looked at her then, and for the first time she caught the full clarity of his eyes. Brown, steady, with a hint of tiredness that spoke of long nights and early mornings. Ma'am, I don't need your money, he said quietly but firmly. Just get where you need to be and take care of that little girl of yours. It was only when he mentioned Lily that Ella realized her daughter had quietly unbuckled herself and slid out of the SUV, clutching her bunny in one hand. She stood beside them now, staring up at the man with unfiltered admiration. Ella opened her mouth to scold her for leaving the car without permission, but Lily spoke first, her voice soft but sure. You fixed Mommy's car, she said, her small face tilted upward, her tone filled with awe. Thank you. Ella drove forward cautiously, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as the patched-up engine hummed uncertainly beneath the hood. Each time the vehicle rattled slightly, her chest constricted with a stab of panic, but she forced herself to focus on the road ahead. The downtown towers loomed like judges, sharp-edged and unforgiving, their mirrored surfaces flashing the sunlight into her eyes. She had always loved this city for its energy, for its ruthless pace that matched her own drive to achieve. But this morning, it felt suffocating, as though every glint of light was another reminder of how fragile control could be. She whispered under her breath the opening lines of her presentation, but the words faltered, not because she had forgotten them, but because they no longer carried the same power in her mind. Her daughter's whisper echoed in her head, softer than any rehearsal, more persistent than any deadline. She's my mom. Please marry her. The words refused to leave her, clinging like invisible threads wrapped around her heart. Ella shook her head, willing herself to dismiss them. Lily was a child, innocent, always weaving little stories in her mind. She had invented imaginary kingdoms and made friends out of stuffed toys. Of course she would see a stranger helping them and in her pure way connect him to the idea of family. But Ella couldn't deny the way her chest tightened, the way her pulse stumbled each time she replayed those words. For one raw second in the middle of the traffic chaos, she had seen something in that man's steady eyes, something solid, something reassuring, something she hadn't allowed herself to crave in years. The boardroom would not forgive lateness, but when she finally arrived, she realized she was late enough to make them shift in their chairs impatiently, yet not so late that the meeting had begun without her. He stood at the glass door, smoothing her wrinkled vest with trembling hands, forcing herself to lift her chin and walk in as though nothing had gone wrong. Inside, the air was cool, the table polished, the men and women seated around it dressed in immaculate suits. Their gazes landed on her like arrows. They didn't ask about her morning, didn't care whether she had fought through smoke and horns and embarrassment on the street. In this world, nothing existed except numbers, confidence, and results. She placed her folder on the table, adjusted the microphone, and began. Her voice was strong, her charts compelling, but even as she presented her vision with the poise she had trained for all her life, her mind flickered back to a pair of oil-stained hands tightening a valve with quiet assurance, to a man crouching down to speak kindly to her daughter. She hated herself for being distracted, hated that a single unexpected encounter had shaken her armor. Yet at the same time, beneath her irritation, there was a tiny ember of warmth she couldn't extinguish. She wondered who he was, where he had learned to carry himself like that, why he hadn't taken her money like everyone else would have. She pushed the questions aside and forced herself to finish, but when the boardroom applauded politely at the end, she felt emptier than she should have. Meanwhile, blocks away from the tall towers of glass and ambition, Daniel Carter tightened the straps of his backpack and guided his bicycle down a quieter side street. The noise of honking horns still echoed faintly from the direction of the intersection he had just left, but he didn't look back. His clothes carried faint streaks of grease now, his palms smelled faintly of coolant, and yet he felt no regret for stopping. He had seen the panic in the woman's eyes, the fear in the little girl's face, and he knew what that fear felt like. He had lived it too many times himself when his own life had spun out of control. As the city gave way to narrower streets lined with brick houses and corner shops, Daniel's breathing steadied with the rhythm of his pedaling. He thought of Lily's words, that innocent whisper that had slipped past all defenses, "Please marry her." For a man who had buried his heart under years of grief and responsibility, the words had struck like a lightning bolt he hadn't seen coming. He hadn't expected to feel anything when he stopped. He had only wanted to do the right thing, to fix what he could in a world that often felt unfixable. Yet that child's simple trust, that effortless way she had imagined him into her story, stirred something he thought was long dead. He shook his head firmly, almost angrily, trying to chase the thought away. At home, his own daughter would be waiting. 6-year-old Lily Carter, his Lily, the center of his world, the reason he worked late nights in the garage and cycled through the city instead of buying a car he couldn't afford. She would be sitting at the kitchen table with crayons scattered across the surface, drawing pictures of houses with big gardens, families holding hands, skies full of rainbows. She always drew families, as if by drawing them enough times, she could somehow make their own family feel whole again. And Daniel each time would ruffle her hair and smile, telling her that the two of them were enough, that they didn't need anyone else. Yet deep down, he knew she wanted more. Children always did. As he pedaled, he wondered what kind of woman that mother had been. The one in the SUV with polished hair and expensive clothes, but eyes that betrayed exhaustion. She was probably someone who lived in a world far above his own. A world of skyscrapers and money and deadlines. A world where men like him were invisible. He told himself it didn't matter. Their paths had crossed by accident, and now they had gone separate ways. He had fixed her car. She had driven off. That was the end of it. But the whisper of her daughter lingered like a stubborn ghost, haunting him with its innocence. By the time Daniel turned onto his street, the chaos of the intersection felt like another universe. Children played in front yards, chasing balls and shouting with laughter. A neighbor waved at him from her porch, and he lifted a hand in return. He parked the bike against his porch rail, pushed open the front door, and breathed in the familiar scent of home, laundry soap, crayons, and the faint aroma of last night's pasta reheated. And there she was, Lily, his Lily, sitting at the table with her crayons, her face lighting up the instant she saw him. "Daddy," she shouted, leaping from her chair and racing to him. She wrapped her little arms around his waist, nearly knocking him off balance. He laughed, scooping her into his arms and spinning her once before setting her back down. "How was school?" he asked, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Good. I drew you something." She raced back to the table and held up a sheet of paper covered in bright colors. In the drawing, there was a man with dark hair and a little girl holding his hand. Beside them stood a woman with golden hair, smiling. Her arms stretched toward them. Daniel's breath caught for a moment. "That's us," Lily explained proudly. "And that's the mommy we don't have yet." Daniel's heart squeezed painfully. He knelt to look her in the eye. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "you and me, we're enough. You know that, right?" She nodded, but her little face was serious. "But maybe one day, Daddy, maybe one day we'll find her." He hugged her tightly, hiding the storm in his chest. As he held his daughter, a flash of the woman from the intersection crossed his mind. Her worried eyes, her determined chin, the way she had thanked him, but seemed unable to understand why he had refused money. He told himself it was a coincidence, that he would never see her again. Yet for the first time in years, the idea of maybe one day didn't feel completely impossible. Crossing paths again. The boardroom had ended with polite applause, signatures scrawled on documents, and the kind of firm handshakes that were supposed to make a person feel accomplished. Ella smiled when appropriate, nodded at compliments, and even exchanged a few jokes with the investors, but as soon as the meeting concluded, she felt drained rather than triumphant. She had delivered her expansion plan flawlessly, the numbers lined up perfectly, and the board had approved the next stage of development for her company. By every external measure, it was a success. Yet when she walked out of the sleek tower and slid back into her patched-up car, her chest felt hollow, as if some invisible weight pressed against it. She told herself it was just exhaustion, that the stress of the morning had unsettled her. But no amount of self-discipline could erase the memory of that stranger bending over her engine with quiet confidence, nor could she silence the echo of her daughter's innocent plea in the back seat. Days passed, but the encounter refused to fade. Each night, Ella found herself working late in her home office, surrounded by papers and glowing screens, but instead of focusing on quarterly reports, and her mind replayed small details she shouldn't have remembered. The way his rough hands had moved so carefully over the engine, the way his voice had been steady without being arrogant, the way Lily had smiled at him as if she had known him forever. Ella reminded herself sternly that she didn't even know his name, that she was letting herself be distracted by something that had no place in her life. Yet her heart betrayed her reason by lingering on the thought. At the same time, Daniel tried to push the memory away as well. His days were full, each hour accounted for between the garage where he worked and the time he spent with his daughter. But at night, when the tools were hung up and Lily had fallen asleep with her bunny tucked under her chin, he would sit at the kitchen table staring at bills and schedules, and his mind would drift back to the woman in the expensive suit who had looked both powerful and fragile in the same moment. He reminded himself firmly that she belonged to a world far removed from his own. He was a mechanic who rode a bicycle through the city because he couldn't justify the expense of a car, while she was clearly someone who commanded boardrooms and drove vehicles worth more than his entire house. Their paths had crossed only by accident, and he knew better than to believe in fairy tales. Yet when he thought of her little girl's whisper, "Please marry her," his chest tightened with something he refused to name. One Saturday morning, fate decided to interfere again. Lily's school was holding its annual fundraiser, a cheerful event filled with parents, children, and community members. Daniel had promised his daughter they would attend, and so he arrived early, helping set up tables, arranging chairs, and volunteering wherever extra hands were needed. He believed in showing his daughter that giving time was just as important as giving money, and the school was always grateful for his willingness to pitch in. The hum of the fundraiser grew as families settled into their seats, the chatter of children mixing with the clinking of plates and the faint sound of the school band warming up. Brightly colored posters hung along the walls, drawn by students declaring phrases like, "Support our school and together we grow." Ella stood near the stage, smoothing the fabric of her navy dress as the principal introduced her to the crowd. She was used to speaking in front of boardrooms filled with skeptical investors, but standing here, surrounded by ordinary parents and their children, felt strangely different. It was less about numbers and more about connection, something she hadn't practiced in years. She took a steadying breath as the microphone was handed to her, the warm spotlight glowing across her face. Daniel shifted in his seat near the back of the cafeteria, his daughter perched on his lap, still clutching her cupcake with sticky fingers. He hadn't expected the woman from the SUV to be here, much less standing on stage, commanding the room with her presence. He had guessed she was important. Her car, her tailored clothes, her urgency that day had all suggested it, but seeing her introduced as a major sponsor of the school fundraiser confirmed it. She didn't just live in another world, she shaped it. And yet, as he watched her begin to speak, he noticed the faint tension in her posture, the slight tremor at the edge of her smile. She looked powerful, yes, but also human, vulnerable. "Good morning, everyone," Ella began, her voice steady but softer than the polished tone she used in the boardroom. "I'm honored to be here today, not just as a sponsor, but as a mother. Our children are the future, and it's our responsibility to make sure they have the opportunities, the support, and the encouragement they need to thrive." She glanced briefly toward her daughter, who was sitting in the second row, beaming with pride as she waved at her. Ella's heart warmed and her words flowed more easily. This school is more than classrooms and books. It's a community. It's where values are shaped, friendships are formed, and dreams take root. The crowd applauded politely, but Ella's eyes flickered involuntarily toward the back of the room. For a brief second, they landed on Daniel, seated quietly, his arms resting protectively around his daughter. Their gazes connected and Ella faltered just slightly, her practiced rhythm broken. She cleared her throat, adjusted her notes, and continued. But something inside her shifted. She was used to commanding attention, but his steady, grounded presence made her feel as though she were the one being measured. It unsettled her. and yet she couldn't look away for long. Daniel felt it too. He hadn't come here for speeches. He had come because Lily loved these events and because he wanted her to know he supported every part of her life. But when Ella spoke about community, about responsibility, he saw a flicker of sincerity in her that surprised him. This wasn't the voice of a cold executive. It was the voice of a mother who cared, even if she didn't always know how to show it. He found himself nodding slightly despite himself. When the speech ended, applause filled the room. Parents clapped, children cheered, and teachers thanked Ella warmly. She stepped down from the stage, relieved, but her relief was short-lived when her daughter dashed forward, tugging her hand with excitement. "Mommy, can we go talk to the man who fixed our car?" Lily asked loudly enough for several nearby parents to hear. Heat rushed into Ella's cheeks and she hesitated, her gaze drawn almost against her will to where Daniel still sat. He had risen to help clean up trays near his table, clearly hoping to avoid the spotlight, but it was too late. For a moment, all four of them stood there suspended in an awkward but strangely gentle silence, the kind that comes when two very different worlds brush against one another and neither side knows what to say first. The children, however, had no such hesitation. Lily Montgomery tugged eagerly on Daniel's daughter's hand, pulling her toward the coloring table set up for kids near the stage. "Come on," she chirped with unshakable confidence. "We can draw together." And just like that, the two girls skipped away, their laughter trailing behind them, leaving the adults with no shield to hide behind. Ella watched her daughter's blonde curls bounce as she disappeared toward the craft table, and then slowly, her eyes returned to Daniel. Without the children's chatter to distract them, she felt the weight of his quiet gaze. He didn't stare in judgment, as so many people did when they saw her step into a room, but he didn't shrink back either. His presence was steady, grounded, as though he had nothing to prove. It disarmed her in a way that unsettled her carefully built defenses. "Thank you again," she said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of the smooth polish she had used on stage. "For the other day. You didn't have to stop, but you did." Daniel shrugged lightly, his hands in his pockets. "You needed help. I knew I could fix it, so I did, that's all." "But you didn't take money," Ella pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were trying to understand the puzzle in front of her. "Most people would have." He gave her a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not everything in life is about money, Ms. Montgomery." The way he said her name made her blink. She hadn't introduced herself, yet of course he had learned it during her speech. Sometimes it's just about doing the right thing. Ella tilted her head, studying him. "And you always do the thing for strangers in the middle of traffic?" "If I can," he replied evenly. "Machines break down, people panic. I know a little about both." His tone carried no arrogance, no attempt to impress. It was simply the truth. The simplicity of his words stirred something inside her. In her world, everything was layered, motives behind motives, deals hidden inside polite conversations, kindness always tangled with expectation. Yet here was a man who had done something without asking for anything in return. She should have dismissed it, should have walked away and chalked him up as a decent Samaritan, but something inside her wouldn't let go. The conversation might have ended there, but the children returned, hands covered in marker stains, proudly holding up their colorful drawings. Both pictures showed families, two parents, two children, smiling beneath big suns and surrounded by flowers. The coincidence struck Ella like a quiet blow. Her daughter had drawn a picture with a man who looked suspiciously like Daniel standing beside them. She wanted to scold her for the bold imagination, but the joy on Lily's face silenced her. Daniel's daughter, meanwhile, had drawn something similar, a house with a wide porch and three figures, her stick figure self holding hands with her father and a blonde-haired woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Ella. The children giggled, showing off their masterpieces as if they had uncovered a secret the adults had yet to admit. Ella felt her cheeks warm while Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Neither said anything about the drawings, but the silence between them became heavy with unspoken meaning. The principal's voice cut across the room, announcing the next stage of the fundraiser. Parents began moving toward the auction tables where donated items and gift baskets were lined up neatly. Ella excused herself, needing the cover of the crowd, and Daniel followed slowly with his daughter. Yet fate was not done with them. At the auction table, they found themselves side by side again, both reaching at the same moment for the bidding sheet of a children's art supply basket. Their hands brushed, and Ella pulled hers back quickly, her breath catching. "Go ahead," Daniel said, gesturing toward the sheet. She hesitated, then picked up the pen. "No, you should," she countered. "Your daughter clearly loves drawing. Mine does too, but she has more crayons than she knows what to do with." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Then maybe it's a tie. We'll let them decide who needs it more." The children, overhearing, ran over and declared with perfect childish logic that they would simply share. "We can both use it," they cried in unison, giggling at their cleverness. The adults exchanged reluctant smiles, unable to argue with the purity of their reasoning. As the fundraiser wound down, parents gathered their children and began filing out. Ella lingered, watching her daughter laugh with Daniel's child, feeling a pang of something she didn't want to name. When she finally turned to leave, Daniel nodded politely, his expression unreadable. She gave him a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted between them. Driving home, Ella stared at the road, her daughter chattering in the back seat about her new friend, about the drawing, about how funny the car fixer was. Ella should have dismissed it, should have reminded her that they lived in different worlds, but she couldn't bring herself to silence her daughter's joy. Instead, she let the words wash over her, though inside her mind a storm of questions raged. She didn't know why the thought of him lingered so stubbornly, but she knew one thing with certainty: this would not be the last time their paths crossed. And far across town, Daniel tucked his daughter into bed that night, smoothing her blankets and kissing her forehead. She looked up at him sleepily and whispered, "Daddy, today felt different. I think maybe we met someone important." He smiled, brushing her curls back gently, but when he turned off the light and sat alone at the kitchen table, he felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. Today had been different, and he wasn't sure if his life would ever go back to being the same. The dinner invitation. The following week unfolded with the steady rhythm of deadlines and board calls for Ella, yet beneath the surface of her polished routines, something restless stirred. Her mind, normally a machine of order and strategy, refused to stop drifting back to the fundraiser. She remembered the soft brush of his hand against hers at the auction table, the way his smile had been small but genuine, and the innocent certainty of their daughters laughing together as though they had known each other forever. Even now, when she sat in her corner office 30 stories above the city, surrounded by the gleaming glass of success, she found herself staring out of the window, wondering how a man who lived such a different life could so easily unsettle hers. Her daughter, however, had no hesitation about what she wanted. Every evening when Ella returned home, tired from negotiations and decisions, Lily would chatter eagerly about her new friend. "She's so funny, Mommy," she would say, kicking her legs under the dinner table. "She likes to draw unicorns, but mine are better at rainbows. And guess what? Her daddy makes pancakes shaped like stars." The principal's voice cut across the room, announcing the next stage of the fundraiser. Parents began moving toward the auction tables, where donated items and gift baskets were lined up neatly. Ella excused herself, needing the cover of the crowd, and Daniel followed slowly with his daughter. Yet fate was not done with them. At the auction table, they found themselves side by side again, both reaching at the same moment for the bidding sheet of a children's art supply basket. Their hands brushed, and Ella pulled hers back quickly, her breath catching. "Go ahead," Daniel said, gesturing toward the sheet. She hesitated, then picked up the pen. "No, you should," she countered. "Your daughter clearly loves drawing. Mine does too, but she has more crayons than she knows what to do with." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Then maybe it's a tie. We'll let them decide who needs it more." The children, overhearing, ran over and declared with perfect childish logic that they would simply share. "We can both use it," they cried in unison, giggling at their cleverness. The adults exchanged reluctant smiles, unable to argue with the purity of their reasoning. As the fundraiser wound down, parents gathered their children and began filing out. Ella lingered, watching her daughter laugh with Daniel's child, feeling a pang of something she didn't want to name. When she finally turned to leave, Daniel nodded politely, his expression unreadable. She gave him a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted between them. Driving home, Ella stared at the road, her daughter chattering in the back seat about her new friend, about the drawing, about how funny the car fixer was. Ella should have dismissed it, should have reminded her that they lived in different worlds, but she couldn't bring herself to silence her daughter's Joe. Instead, she let the words wash over her, though inside her mind a storm of questions raged. She didn't know why the thought of him lingered so stubbornly, but she knew one thing with certainty: this would not be the last time their paths crossed. And far across town, Daniel tucked his daughter into bed that night, smoothing her blankets and kissing her forehead. She looked up at him sleepily and whispered, "Daddy, today felt different. I think maybe we met someone important." He smiled, brushing her curls back gently, but when he turned off the light and sat alone at the kitchen table, he felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. Today had been different, and he wasn't sure if his life would ever go back to being the same. The dinner invitation. The following week unfolded with the steady rhythm of deadlines and board calls for Ella, yet beneath the surface of her polished routines, something restless stirred. Her mind, normally a machine of order and strategy, refused to stop drifting back to the fundraiser. She remembered the soft brush of his hand against hers at the auction table, the way his smile had been small but genuine, and the innocent certainty of their daughters laughing together as though they had known each other forever. Even now, when she sat in her corner office 30 stories above the city, surrounded by the gleaming glass of success, she found herself staring out of the window, wondering how a man who lived such a different life could so easily unsettle hers. Her daughter, however, had no hesitation about what she wanted. Every evening when Ella returned home, tired from negotiations and decisions, Lily would chatter eagerly about her new friend. "She's so funny, Mommy," she would say, kicking her legs under the dinner table. "She likes to draw unicorns, but mine are better at rainbows. And guess what? Her daddy makes pancakes shaped like stars." Daniel's hand froze on the rag he was holding, his eyes narrowing slightly in cautious surprise. "Dinner?" he repeated slowly, as if the word itself didn't fit neatly into his life. "Yes," she said quickly, almost defensively. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a meal. My daughter would love it, and I'd like to thank you properly." He hesitated, the lines of weariness deepening around his eyes. Pride warred with practicality inside him. He wasn't a man who accepted favors easily, and the thought of stepping into her world, into a polished dining room filled with things he could never afford, made his chest tighten. Yet when he glanced down, he saw his own daughter's face alight with excitement. She was already tugging at his sleeve, whispering, "Please, Daddy, please say yes. I want to play with her again." Daniel sighed softly, defeated not by Ella's persistence but by the joy shining in his child's eyes. He looked back at Ella, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. "All right," he said finally. "Dinner." That evening, Ella opened her home to them. Her apartment, perched high above the city, glowed with soft light and modern elegance. Daniel looked slightly out of place as he stepped inside, his worn jacket hanging awkwardly over one arm, his boots squeaking faintly against the polished floors. But his daughter rushed in with wide eyes, marveling at the tall windows and the glittering skyline beyond. Lily Montgomery grabbed her hand instantly, dragging her toward a pile of toys, and within moments the two girls were laughing together as if they had shared a lifetime of secrets. Ella guided Daniel toward the dining table, set neatly with simple but elegant dishes. For a while the conversation was hesitant, filled with pauses and polite nods. But as the children's laughter filled the apartment, the walls between them began to thin. Ella asked about Uda's work at the garage, and he spoke with quiet pride about fixing cars, about the satisfaction of solving problems with his hands. She admitted that she had never so much as changed a tire, and they both laughed, the sound bridging the gap between their worlds. When dinner was served, the atmosphere softened further. The children sat side by side, giggling at inside jokes only they understood, while the adults slowly allowed themselves to relax. Ella found herself smiling more than she had in months, her shoulders loosening, her heart strangely lighter. For Daniel, the polished apartment and delicate dishes felt foreign, but Ella's warmth disarmed his discomfort. He realized she wasn't just the CEO he had imagined. Beneath the surface, She was a mother yearning for connection, just as he was. And then it happened. As dessert was served, Lily Montgomery leaned against Ella, her small hand resting trustingly on her arm. "Thanks, Mommy," she said sleepily, her voice carrying the innocence of a child lost in comfort. The room fell silent. Ella's breath caught, her eyes darting to Daniel, whose fork paused halfway to his mouth. His gaze was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something he quickly masked. Ella's heart raced. She knew her daughter had spoken without thinking, guided only by the safety she felt in the moment. She should have corrected her, should have gently explained, but the word lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. For one brief, breathless second, she didn't want to correct her at all. Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and set his fork down. "It's getting late," he said softly, his tone even, but carrying a weight Ella couldn't decipher. He glanced at his daughter, who was already nodding sleepily, then back at Ella. "Thank you for dinner. It was nice."